welcome to our next panel discussion. I'm Dr. Rebecca Lewison. I'll be the moderator for this panel, and I'm delighted that you're all here. I'm going to start with Dr. Sarah Brower. Sarah, you can give a little wave. Sarah is a senior planner at the City of San Diego Public Utilities Department, where she focuses on long-range water resource planning and engages on a variety of issues, including climate adaptation, water supply, water system operations, watershed management, and the San Diego Integrated Regional Water Management Program. She also manages projects to improve water quality in the city's watersheds and reservoirs. Next to her, we've got Heidi Brau. If you could just give a little wave, there she is. Heidi is a water resource specialist, and she works with the Pala Band of Mission Indians and the Pala Environmental Department. Heidi works on a wide range of water programs, including overseeing drinking water compliance programs, drought management water programs, agricultural irrigation efficiency and sampling. She also works on groundwater and climate change planning. Next to her, we have Mrs. Amber Bruno. Give a wave there. She's a biologist and a natural resource program manager with Rincon Consultants. Amber's expertise includes environmental review, including California Environmental Quality Act, that's CEQA, which we've been chatting about a little bit in the previous panel, and biological resource permitting and mitigation planning for complex utility projects. And then we're delighted to invite someone you just met in the video, Mr. Jack Mikesell, to our panel. Jack is a water resource and civil engineer. He's also a member of the CWC research team. Again, you were just hearing about his work on watershed modeling, using high resolution spatial data sets to model post-fire hydrologic and sedimentation processes. And Jack also is a water resource engineer at Paradigm Environmental, where he supports watershed modeling, green infrastructure design, compliance, and municipal stormwater planning events. So Jack can be wearing both of his hats today. So thank you to everyone in the panel. Thank you so much for being here. And again, thanks everyone for joining us for this conversation. So where should we start? I think I'd love to start with you, Sarah, and maybe, I'll pass this question down to everyone. But maybe the first question I'll pose to our panel is, when it comes to water sustainability, what do you see as the biggest challenge in your work? And what are you most concerned about in your jurisdiction from a climate readiness perspective?
Well, great question. And thank you for having me on the panel. Delighted to be here. So I'll respond on, in my role for a public utility that, we have a lot of challenges, one being supply management, right? So that is our core focus, right, is providing safe and reliable drinking water to our ratepayers here in San Diego. But of course, that involves a lot of different kind of work. And our department owns roughly 40,000 acres of land to preserve and protect water quality upstream of our 9 city-owned reservoirs. So integral to our supply planning and management is land management itself, and that is integrated and complex. And because we're here in Southern California, we rely still on imported water. We have a very complex water infrastructure system that also adds complexity to disentangling the multiple factors that influences our supply and our water quality. So those, I would say, are the largest sort of challenges and complexities that really influence how we think, and also why we really benefit from science to help us disentangle this really complex system of impacts to our land and that impacts water quality flowing into our reservoirs, as well as our infrastructure system and how it all works together, because everything's changing simultaneously.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Heidi, your thoughts on that from your perspective and experience?
So working for a small tribal community, which I mean, our population is like 1,300 people, so it's that's very small, but we have a lot of the same concerns, primarily just water scarcity, because there's the availability of water in our region is decreasing, and the water need is going up with tons of people moving in. And while that might not be true with our community, if we don't have a lot of people moving in, but just to reiterate what Megan had said in the previous session, that like our tribal members, this is their land, this is the land that they were, they lived on before and that they've been given. They're not leaving the area, so it's really vital for us to protect the resource that we have. And while we have the same concerns as everyone else of, like droughts are increasing, we have higher temperatures, we have flashier systems, so our precipitation is, kind of wonky. We have the added stressors of our tribal community is entirely dependent on our groundwater source. So we do not get water from outside of our region, which unlike most of the region, they're getting water from Northern California or the Colorado River. So it makes the challenge of really communicating to our leadership in our community how precious our water is and what we need to do to protect it. But it also makes it really important for us to try to work and educate our surrounding, like surrounding jurisdictions on just how important that water is to us, and really planning on a much wider scale, because we all are dependent on that water, whether it's upstream agricultural uses or downstream drinking water systems that are trying to reduce how much they're taking outside of the areas and using local sources more, which then puts more stress on ours. So it makes it really important for us to kind of work with outside jurisdictions to share this resource in a responsible way.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense, and certainly echoes a lot of the conversations that you were sort of hearkening back to the previous panel on these critical conversations we need to be having, right? Not all the jurisdictions are reliant on groundwater in the sense that you've just articulated in your jurisdiction, but this it's critical. You can't be doing this alone,
yeah.
Right? Amber, your thoughts on sort of major challenges of water sustainability that you've been experiencing or facing or dealing with in your work, and what your sort of biggest concerns that you're seeing in terms of the radar on climate change and water sustainability, climate adaptation.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Rebecca. To add to that, I mean, it's all the same types of challenges that we're seeing. And what I'm really excited about is this baseline data set that we'll be able to use, and our partners and our colleagues will be able to use to set a framework to start the conversation. Because that is a huge challenge for a lot of the different entities that I work with, is really just knowing where to start and what type of information is available to them so they can support their decision making with science, essentially. And that will continue to be a huge challenge in moving into the future, even after we implement these great adaptation strategies, is having utilities, water districts access to those successes so that they can implement them in their own regions, in their own jurisdictions. And I think we all know we can't do this fast enough, but this is a huge stepping stone in having access and available data to start the conversations, start the collaborative projects, and move forward with some adaptation strategies.
Amber, that's a fantastic point, and I'm going to turn it to you, Jack, also, so you can weigh in on this. But as we're talking, I hope all the participants and attendees are really hearing that, we are focusing on this particular CWC project. But Amber, I think you just brought up a really important point that I would think would speak to really everyone listening to the panel right now, which is we need this common frame of reference. We need to have a common set of data that we can all look at and talk about. We're talking about critical conversations. We want the conversations to be driven and supported by the best available science and data. And so that model of pulling together information that is then shared so we can start the conversations with the same understanding on the same page and really understanding the same information about the water and the watersheds, I think is a really important one that certainly extends beyond Southern California. Jack, can I turn it to you as someone who's been creating these great data sets that Amber was just talking about and pulling them together. Maybe you want to share some thoughts on creating that baseline data where you see opportunities to expand or build on the work that you and Alicia are already working on.
Sure, thanks, Rebecca. Going back to your first question when thinking about challenges on the research side, I don't know if this is the challenge because I do find it invigorating, but there is so much research being done in everything that impacts the water cycle right now. And although a lot of times we're dealing with water once it reaches streams or on the street, the impact and the scientific know-how that's required to understand what's going on is so vast and broad that I guess the challenge for modelers, the challenge for, I guess, people designing infrastructure is how do we integrate, this expanding field of research on climate change, on global precipitation patterns, on soil dynamics, on changing vegetation types, especially here in the Southwest. There's so much research that you almost have to constantly, when you're building models, they have to be dynamic these days. You have to have something that you can't just use the same data now that you're going to use in 5 years. So I think a challenge would be integrating that data and building up kind of a database in which we can constantly update facts that we are attaining from research knowledge into publicly available data sets that we can actually plug right into our models, and on the other side build models that are adaptable to be able to use changing data. And kind of on putting my other cap on, my consultant cap, we have this tremendous responsibility working for municipalities and public agencies that, these are very difficult decisions to make of where we want to spend money on adapting our infrastructure to meet the needs required by a changing climate and changing conditions. And, it's difficult those choices are difficult to make. So I think the challenge would be using those dynamic models that I discussed, using the most updated data we have, and be able to most responsibly use what is almost entirely public dollars, taxpayer dollars, to build infrastructure that we know will withstand, or we can model so that we hope they withstand some of the things that climate change is inducing, changes to precipitation patterns, drought conditions, all of that. So being able to integrate that in the most fiscally and scientifically responsible way.
Great, thanks for that. I love the themes that Jack just mentioned in terms of flexibility for data, in addition, just building on that same idea of access, but also ability to integrate. And I want to just build on that and also something that Sarah, that you mentioned, because one of the goals of this project, and I would imagine, again, for other folks working in the Southwest, and certainly something that we see as really critical, what really drove, I know Megan was talking about this in the beginning, drove the development of the project, is how do we build bridges? So people working on water, and Sarah, you said this, are also really focused on land management, because of course those two things are directly related. And so I was wondering if maybe, Sarah, we could, for the next round of questions, have you sort of talk about where you see you have been able to build bridges with people who don't work on water, but need water for, you know, what they're responsible for to manage, just the way you need sort of responsible land management for the resource that you are tasked with monitoring and managing and keeping in this, you know, the sense of, you know, supply and quality. And so either a bridge that you feel like exists, or where you are looking to build one or excited to build one, or we could sort of look towards what that building bridge might look like, whether it's to land management or fire management or any of the other topics that I know are really relevant in this context and in this conversation. So Sarah, is that something that you feel like you could speak to a little?
Absolutely. Great question. And I'll just start by framing, you know, here in San Diego, a lot of our water supply management and water supply planning historically has been really infrastructure focused, because we're importing a lot of our water. And now we're in this phase of diversifying our assets as a resilient strategy. And so we have, for example, a Pure Water San Diego program that's recycling our wastewater into potable water. And we're more and more turning to looking at our native sources of water, which is precipitation, as being, you know, an important thing to really think about moving forward. And the land management is completely driven and influenced by partnerships across jurisdictional boundaries. A lot of the work that we have in our rural lands has benefited from grant funding. Our restoration projects, in particular, most recently, we've had some funded through the Integrated Regional Water Management Program, which is a California program to help water agencies and work with non-water agencies on projects to focus on multi-benefits of land management, with water supply and quality being one of them, but all the benefits to biological communities being another co-benefit. And that's been really critical, for example, because our, at least for public utilities, our water fund land assets are managed for the priority of protecting source water for water quality. We're mandated for that to be the top priority because we are funded by our ratepayers. So that's why this partnership approach is really critical, because that allows us to loop in these other benefits, work with other our stormwater folks, to work with Forest Service, to work with other partners, our agricultural community here in San Diego. So that's been really critical. And I just want to end by sort of highlighting the city of San Diego also has been doing a lot of work recently on climate planning. We have a climate action plan that has led to a vulnerability assessment of our assets. And that has included looking at vulnerability of our open space. And that started the conversation of what do these adaptation strategies look like for addressing those vulnerabilities. And so that conversation is going on right now on how to think about doing that. And that includes a challenge of how do you track progress towards meeting those goals. So this conversation today is an example of why this is so timely, is because being able to quantify, know what our baseline conditions are, can be challenging when you're talking about a distributed asset that's not a point on a map. It's a large area. So I'll end there, and just maybe others can kind of comment on how this sort of baseline information and science, you know, is feeding into how they're thinking about management of these landscapes and climate adaptation as well.
Great. Great, Heidi, either on that, I think Sarah's question is a great follow-up if you wanted to speak to that, or talk as well about some of the bridges that you see sort of that are critical to your work. And again, they could be bridges between sort of areas of management or science, but they can also be bridges to stakeholders, right? We're looking to this project, I feel like is looking to serve as this model towards how we can bridge science, bridge management and practice, and also bridge to have new people in conversation that haven't been before. So I don't know, Heidi, if something in there
Yeah, so
resonates for you.
thank you, Becca. And I will say, so I've been in this position for about 15 years. And in that time, I feel like, when I first started, tribes were often left out at the table. It's an afterthought. We'd only be brought in when there was a TMDL down the river and they wanted to blame, a wealthier casino tribe, or there's regulations or, things like that. So, but I feel like, in the last decade, really, there's been a push to involve tribes more in the planning stage, and especially Climate Science Alliance has been fantastic with this. I mean, if any organization should be used as a model going forward, I think that we've had a really brilliant relationship with them where, they've brought us in and we plan things together. And I just think that that's so beneficial. Because it really builds this long-term relationship, but it also gets tribal input of, like what our needs are and how they can help us, and then in turn, how we can help them. Often involving tribes in grant applications or projects makes that project or grant application a lot more competitive. Really, any project that has multiple partners will make it more competitive. And so we've had a number of successes with Climate Science Alliance with that. And then also specifically our tribe has worked with our local watershed council, which is looking at, broad scale watershed planning, and been able to obtain grant funding to do, implementation projects throughout not only our reservation, but the entire watershed, which is beneficial to replenishing our groundwater resources for the whole watershed. And I think that kind of model going forward is really beneficial. The other thing that I would mention too is, sorry, and I don't want to go on too much, but some of the GIS data sets that have been developed for the CWC project have been, it's wonderful to see them, and it makes, outreaching to whomever, either your leadership or your direct community or other, partners kind of peripherally around you. It really makes, it makes it really clear and easy to communicate what your needs are, or what behavior modification you're trying to get your community to do, or just giving everyone, all the partners, peripheral partners, an equal kind of a shared vision of, what our current condition is and what we're working towards, which everyone on the panel has already kind of reiterated too. And I do see that, that's already happening, and it's just we'll be able to do a lot more, I think, going forward with these. So, yeah.
Great. Amber, I know now we've hit a couple different, I'm not going to go in the same order every time, Amber, because now I feel like the question is like morphed 17 times. So any of the questions that are these great topics that you wanted to build on, I promise I'll start with you next time.
No, that's fine. I was about to jump in and chase what Heidi was saying there as well. Yeah, and education and being able to advocate for the behavior changes that we're looking for using this GIS data is a huge benefit of this tool, these tools that are being created, and not only just for your region, but also outside of that, especially when we're thinking about impacted waterways and things like that, be able to see your upstream and downstream resources and have a better picture of how projects and actions and strategies upstream or downstream from you are going to affect your abilities to manage your lands as a land manager, coming up with additional adaptation strategies for your specific project. So having that information to advocate, but also having the bigger picture of what's going on around you and how it influences your region is so important.
Yeah, and another type of bridge that I didn't even mention, just to build on what you just said, Amber, is jurisdictional bridge. So we have water service saying like San Diego, city of San Diego, but obviously what happens in a broader context, and I think that is very important. And I think that'll be something that resonates for lots of people who are listening from all over about the critical nature of just the building bridges across jurisdictions or whatever, the size of the watershed that people are tasked with managing. So their mandate stops and ends, but of course the water does not. So I think that's a really important one. Jack, for you, I wanted to maybe just take this question and ask you, since you've been someone who's been part of the research team, to maybe talk a little bit about what working across your disciplinary boundary has, how has that impacted how you've thought about the work that you do, or again, sort of those future directions, or the horizon of where you see we need to be going, specifically from this boundary spanning perspective, because I think for the scientists, it's just important that we cross those boundaries and build the bridges.
Sure, yeah, I think it's great. I think all of our panelists kind of took my words out of my mouth. I think this idea from Sarah, I think that's a really good way to put it, viewing water as this distributed asset, and how much that ties into both what Heidi and Amber were saying about tribes being on the upstream end and only being brought in for TMDL compliance, or municipalities and agencies being, ultimately you really need to know what's happening both upstream and downstream of the area that you're managing, because the impacts can be so vast. I think all of these, questions, concerns, I think that's exactly what we're trying to get at here, both with the compilation of these data sets and into, something large and publicly available, where, across regional boundaries, everyone can use and have the same data. So it's a lot more translatable from region to region, or from municipality to municipality. I think that's so crucial to what we're doing. And to try bring that into kind of this modeling framework that we're developing, where models really have a really key influence is for areas that may lack data. Having high resolution data is so crucial to making management decisions, especially for planning things out for the long term, that where models can step in is, although using models isn't just, an end all be all for lack of data availability, it's a much better tool than having absolutely nothing. Even if maybe there's an area downstream of what you're seeking to manage, we can, because water is this distributed resource, we can use the specific points where we have data available to best fill in those areas where maybe that data is not as accessible to both, stakeholders, land managers, just really any member of the public that's concerned with what's happening around their community. So I think it's so crucial to look at water as not just, okay, I want to manage the effects that are happening, just at the downstream end of my city or county or street or whatever, because that's not really the solution to, these pretty vast issues that we're trying to solve. It's so crucial to build partnerships across regions, all the way from, outlets to the coast, all the way up to the headwaters. It's so crucial to have those partnerships, because everyone's decisions and actions affect everyone downstream and upstream of them. And I think that is kind of the main focus of developing these data sets and developing this model, is we think that is a really good way to be able to connect all these different stakeholders and land managers and groups of people. We can use the model, use the data to connect everyone kind of on a level playing field, and that lets everyone put their best foot forward for the long-term planning that we're after.
Yeah, excellent. Amber, I'm going to start with you. What I'm hearing, one of these key themes that we're all talking about are sort of the importance of when we think about like one of the key things that the CWC projects or other projects that, that may be similar or inspired, hopefully, by CWC is this idea of sharing data. That's something that a lot of folks on the panel have talked about. Visualizing is really critical. I feel like it's something you might have mentioned. Jack was talking about data integration. I was wondering if maybe you could talk about what some of the barriers have been on that pathway of trying to use scientific data to implementation to support climate adaptation. And I'll get to everyone. I'm just going to start with Amber because she's been at the end of the list and it's always hard. I know, and everybody says everything.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Rebecca. I'll answer that. I'm going to tie it in a little bit to more of what we've been talking about, though, in building these bridges. And something we've touched on very briefly are really the co-benefits between implementing these strategies. And this tool helps build bridges and connecting and understanding those co-benefits, not only for water storage, potentially pollutants and erosions and impacted waterways, vegetation, wildlife habitat, being able to understand even across those different environmental resources, the various co-benefits we have for implementing strategies. One that helps one immensely helps the other. And this data set helps provide that and connect that. I think when we're talking about from a land management standpoint and wildlife habitat, we see the changes in precipitation affect wildlife communities. We also see recreation and trails, access to those communities affecting erosion. That also affects wildlife. So there's a lot of these different bridges that we can build in the data sets for understanding the effects and co-benefits across that. That will continue, however, to be a barrier as well until we can really start playing with the data and get down to the hard questions Jack brought up on where do we prioritize this funding and implementation, and where is this money, this time going to be the biggest benefit for all in understanding those co-benefits. And then using those co-benefits to leverage more funding to implement more best practices and strategies from there. And to answer your question, as far as one of the biggest challenges, I think that's really it. But this tool really is going to help break down those barriers.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's with great power comes great responsibility, right? When we have it, we've made it more complex when we connect and build bridges, and we're having these conversations across municipalities or across these different I'm saying disciplinary, but sort of areas of focus that each of us maybe work on in the climate change, climate adaptation space. It doesn't make it easier, right? But I think I hear what you're saying about how important it is. Heidi, and then Heidi, for sure, you get to go first next time. Your thoughts on this, on some of the challenges maybe, or building on anything that Amber said for sure, or thinking about some of the, we've talked about the importance of data and the importance of science, and maybe what some of the barriers you've faced or experienced on how that can support or hasn't been able to or hasn't been leveraged fully to support implementation for the goal in your jurisdiction.
Well, so I'll say that one of the biggest challenges for a lot of tribes, no matter where they are, and I think this probably includes a lot of rural, smaller areas and jurisdictions too, is just the lack of, data or technical expertise. So, for example, I am it for our water resource, like I am the water resource department for our tribe. So it's why, I know a lot of other jurisdictions will have, like they can get in silos because they only work on one aspect. But here in smaller jurisdictions, I have drinking water compliance, and I also oversee, like our surface water and, groundwater and a bunch of different things in between. So it's, I'm always constantly taking one hat off and putting another one on. So kind of the broad scale management is a little bit easier for us because there's just not enough people to go around. But having that accurate data, and that this kind of brings in what Jack was saying, one of the wonderful things about having this modeling is that, that really takes a burden off of tribes or other jurisdictions that might not have all of the access to that data, because we just simply don't have those resources available. So not only does it help to connect us to, like our neighbors, so that we're all looking at the same resource and using the same data, and we can make, decisions together that are more efficient and, better for the entire watershed. But it helps, it helps improve all of our planning efforts, and our technical documentation, and just really how we proceed going forward. And I just lost what I was going to say, but so basically, that's one of our biggest hurdles, is just the lack of technical expertise. And so that's why partnering with scientists or educational, universities and stuff, and other, neighboring jurisdictions really can help elevate not only our, resource management, but on a much larger scale too, because we're all working together for, a common purpose.
Right, absolutely. Sarah, and now it's always hard at the end because anything that anyone has talked about, it's fair game for you. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I'll echo the comments around these data are critical for prioritization, especially if you are managing a large area. Where do you prioritize funds? And so these GIS layers have been really great to look at not just water, but also fire and human impacts and refuge. And then you can start to overlay all these interacting factors and really identify these hotspots. When we've looked at these data, one of the things that have jumped out is riparian areas are just so critical. So we can really focus in on those. So this really helps for justifying grant budgets, but also existing budgets. When it comes to land management, maybe in the past you could just preserve and protect and sort of have a do nothing approach, and that was enough. But with the changing environment and with climate change, can we do that? Will that be effective? One of the things I noticed from one of the CWC products was around human impacts and trails and where refuge was. And what was really interesting is it kind of highlighted some of our existing preservation activities we've done in the past are really targeting these refuge areas. So we can use that to really promote that we need to continue this work and really make sure that it doesn't get underfunded or misunderstood in the value, because as we have more and more people moving into Southern California, there's going to be more pressure and competing interests on our land. We have all kinds of off-road vehicles and unauthorized trails and so much that it's just, there's too much work to do. So having these data really can help give everyone that common knowledge, prioritize efforts, and then also start to quantify the benefits of what you're doing in a way that's easy to tell the story. So,
yeah. Oh, that's the perfect jumping off point for where I wanted to go with that. Thank you, Sarah, for that fantastic unplanned segue of tell the story. Because where I wanted to go from here was to say, well, I'm a scientist, so I think a lot about data, and I know all of you on the panel do as well. But I would love to talk a little bit about, because I think it's important, and we were just talking about this pathway of science implementation and all the different ways that CWC and these types of data in other regions, throughout the Southwest can be really important. But I would love to turn and just have us think for a round or so to think about outreach, education, and awareness, because I think as much as we all wear our data hat, and data is so important, and there's a yes and here of And I think data can be part of that. Actually, we were talking about data visualization. A great map, I think Heidi, you were saying this, is worth a tremendous amount. So to be able to communicate what these challenges are from a water perspective, or the bridges we need to build to other municipalities or jurisdictions or divisions within where we're working to help people understand. So maybe we could hear everyone think a little bit or talk a little bit, share your ideas on what you see as sort of how outreach and education and just general climate awareness, and I would include climate expression in here because I think it's really critical, and would love everyone to go check the art walk out just so I can add that in there. And I'll start with you, Heidi, maybe in your context, how different types of climate conversations and climate discussion outside of the science realm are really critical for your job and where you see the future of climate adaptation.
Thanks. That's a great. So I love outreach. It's one of the things that like I'm always happy to do because it's just so valuable to try to figure out a way to communicate what you need to whatever audience you're trying to communicate it to. I think so. Maybe I'll break it down to a couple different types of audiences. So like when I'm communicating to our leadership, I think things like these wide set data sets are really valuable to show them it's not just happening here, it's happening all over the place. And so if, it's not enough for us to do something just in our little spot or even just hang back, kind of like what Sarah was talking about, that, like the hands off, just let it kind of, preserve what it's doing right now, that passiveness, it's not really going to be enough. So we really need to take it a step further. So I think like some of these tool sets are super valuable for communicating that to leadership who, like you really do have to make an economic point of like why this is valuable, why should they spend money to do this? You're asking, and just how many different facets it's gonna, benefit. And then for more community outreach, which is what I really like to do, just like you said, Rebecca, like a picture is worth, 1,000 words. So as much as I can ramble on, being able to show one picture is just so much more powerful. And I think that, in all the years that I've done either tribal outreach or just on a watershed wide level, in both aspects, when I'm communicating to a community, I think it's really important to show people why you're asking them to make a behavior change or why it's, change is needed, or to really show them what they're trying to protect. So, like we've incorporated some of our sacred mountain, which is the mountain that's kind of in back of us. So you can see we've incorporated that and a bunch of our other natural resources that are important to our tribe in all of our environmental outreach. So all of our climate change outreach that we do to, within our community, the seed of it always starts and ends with, like what is important to this community. And then you can go and explain, well, I'm asking you to do this because it's going to preserve this important element. And really showing people how they connect to not just, neighbors upstream and downstream or, other tribal members, but also how they connect to the natural world. I think that is always where you should, start a conversation, and using art too, just to plug that art. I mean, using art to express that is just so valuable because, it really hits people on an emotional level, and you need to engage people on that emotional level in order to make change, in order to get them to change. Because people, it's like, people are like water. It always goes to the lowest point, the point of least resistance. So you have to inspire them or, kind of hit them in the heartstrings for them to actually make a change. So.
People are like water going on our next CWC t-shirt. Thank you, Heidi, for that. Sarah or Amber, jumping in on the idea of outreach and education in your experience. I don't know how much that is a hat that you wear in your current position.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, or yeah, okay. Absolutely, community engagement is a big part of what we do, and a continuous struggle for planners and jurisdictions that are trying to implement behavioral change at a policy level. I think that's so important because inspiring the communities, they're going to push their policymakers for the things that they're looking for. But another component of this, and I know that this is a big ambition of CWC as well, is again providing that information, that access to the policymakers. They're just barely scraping by. As we know, populations are growing, the demands on our planning departments is growing and growing, their limited time, limited resources. Being able to get to them, provide them with, hey, these tools, and these are how you can use them, is a huge requirement for this tool being used to its fullest abilities, I think. And another component, not just with the community engagement, is finding a way to crack into those agencies and jurisdictions. You know, there's various associations like the APA, and showcase the data and how they can use it and make it easy, because again, they're just overwhelmed with the amount of work that they have to do to begin with. So I think that's a huge component of outreach.
Absolutely. Data accessibility. It's not enough just to say, here you go, right? There needs to be ways in and a narrative that really is accessible as well. That's a really critical point. I'm glad you added that. Sarah, anything to add to our conversation, thinking about outreach or climate awareness, climate expression, education?
I'll just add a sort of lesson from the fourth climate change assessment work that the Climate Science Alliance was involved in. And I've sort of been on the back end of that, of benefiting from the integration of this robust effort to synthesize sort of new data sets in a new way and communicate it really all the way up to the state and really integrate and sort of change that mindset. But what that does is it's internalized that information. And now, years later, we have our planning department putting together, climate vulnerability assessments, or our department working on climate action plan requirements for NPDES permits and referencing those. So the more we can bring these large scale data sets, these regional data sets, to be sort of adopted at a higher level, that does really, I've seen really change how the information is being used. And then we don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's there. We can reference, these are the changes we're seeing, like the type conversion and fire, like having that to just reference and include in your climate action plan reporting or any other planning document is hugely beneficial. So there's a great return on investment for thinking about communicating this. We talked about to the public, but also up to, legislators and to the higher level and practitioners.
Yeah, we've got probably enough for one round for everyone to weigh in on. And I'd love to take this to a regional context for as we think about, I know it's always, well, I think this way too. We sort of think locally, but we're going to maybe pivot to be thinking about sort of regionally how our work fits in. But before we did that, Jack, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, I feel like you've been echoing and we're sort of on the same page, but as the representative from Team Water, and I know you also wear a hat as a practitioner, but are there things that you've heard that you feel like, one of the key goals of CWC in the project, just framework that we're trying to share with everyone is this co-production, like we're working with practitioners, we're working with planners. Was there anything that you took away that you feel like will guide, the water team's research going forward? You mentioned creating dynamic and flexible models. Is there anything else that you feel like you were going to take back from our conversation to Team Water as a next step?
Sure. I think this stakeholder outreach elements of the project are so crucial because of lack of resources and because of the way we are kind of pigeonholed by permits about permits regarding surface water. A lot of times the cheapest and easiest way to clean up your stormwater is, this is an oversimplification, but essentially dig a hole in the ground the most downstream you can, build a big box, store a bunch of water into it, and infiltrate it into the ground. And yeah, that's great, and that'll clean your water before it is departing your watershed. But that doesn't really address all of the needs that that these water infrastructure projects can address. You can clean your water and give much more value to the community, whether that's beautifying public spaces and parks, where yes, they're serving as water treatment elements, but they are also serving a huge resource in the community for recreation or just for overall beautification, just making people happier. A water treatment project can be a community garden. A water treatment project can be a green street that puts medians in the middle of your streets and make them a lot more pleasurable and help revitalize that part of the community. Sarah mentioned the Pure Water Project in San Diego at the beginning of this. The Pure Water Project isn't just about the infrastructure to recycle water. You can go to the Pure Water facility, and it has a whole education arm, and you can walk around and you can feel the filters that the water is being passed through to clean. You can see the pipes that were built in order to achieve this. So when I think about outreach, I kind of think it's so important to tie that into, well, what are we actually building? What are we actually trying to solve? And it's so important to broaden our minds out of just, okay, what's the best, cheapest way, easiest way to meet the permits? And kind of broaden that out to, okay, well, what's a way that we can actually enhance the community that people can touch and feel and see, and will actually have an impact on their lives outside of just, we're not getting fined by the EPA. I think that's such a crucial element that I hope this project, tries to instill in people and kind of bring us into a greater consciousness around that.
Fantastic. To close us out, this has been such a great panel, and I appreciate everybody's input. Amber and Sarah and Heidi, it might be a little bit more of a lightning round. We've got about 6 minutes. I know we've been talking a lot about partnerships and building bridges and co-benefits. I'm wondering if we could take this, given that our audience and participants are from across the Southwest, how we can think about this sort of coordination on water resources, the shared assets, Sarah, you were talking about across the Southwest. When we think about where our drinking water comes from and groundwater, right? This is not a local, these are not local, these are global, regional assets. How about Heidi, I start with you on this one.
Just where I see that we could be going.
Sort of thinking regionally and regional coordination, yeah.
Sarah had brought up the integrated resource management planning effort that's been going on regionally, and some of the other tribes have been participating within that too. But I like the idea of planning things around, projects that you're implementing. It just kind of like what Jack was saying, that sometimes the easiest, cheapest way is not the best, because you can do so many different things that also beautify or add recreation. Water has so many different benefits to it that really we should try to include as many as possible. So I'd really love this to kind of branch into more implementation management and sharing what everyone is doing, what projects are going where, so that there are more there are more possibilities for doing projects together and building relationships that way, because that always that's a great way to get community members and leadership coming out to to your area. It's an easy way to explain the science behind it. So there's all kinds of possibilities, I think, with that.
Great. Sarah, your thoughts on sort of regional coordination of this shared asset that you were talking about at the beginning of the panel?
I think it would be great to share knowledge around how folks are quantifying the benefits of their project so that we can use that to estimate the benefits of a similar project we want to implement here. So for example, ripping out invasive species and maybe the supply benefits because they're not soaking up all that groundwater. How are you quantifying that? How are you doing that on a large scale or on a small scale or projecting out into the future? And that's just one example. There could be so many, stormwater project examples where we could benefit from that knowledge sharing, because then we can start to really think about how much return on our investment are we going to get from investing in this new stormwater infrastructure or this, habitat restoration project or something like that.
Great. Amber, closing us out.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely echoing what Heidi and Sarah were sharing. That's the beauty of these tools and providing that visual resource where you can just scroll over on the map and look for an area, a vegetation type or region that's similar to yours. Even soil types and infiltration rates. So there's a lot of opportunity for applicability, and so long as we can make sure that there's access to those programs and projects that are being implemented for the wider region, to play with that data, to look at how it is being implemented and potential opportunities, similarities between the challenges or the results that other groups or regions are looking for.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you all so much. I just am so appreciative of all of your time for the panelists. I want to thank everyone who was listening today. Encourage everyone to still post questions. We can continue the conversation with the panelists and everyone just sharing their own ideas. I know there's been some great chats, and also just encourage everyone to post. A reminder, we are taking a Zoom break from 12 to 12:30, but we'll be back for our next panel. I think the Zoom will turn on at 12:20, but the next panel will start 12:30. We'll be talking about climate change and natural landscapes. So thank you again, all the panelists. I really appreciate all your insights and ideas and information that you shared with us today, and look forward to continuing the conversation after lunch at 12:30.